are blessed to have Dr. Cahleen Shrier here with us to speak about the science of Christ's crucifixion. And she is a professor of biology at Azusa Pacific University in California, which sounds pretty nice right now. I'm coming in from Toronto tonight, and it is seasonally quite warm, but California sounds pretty great. So we're very glad to have her with us tonight. She teaches general biology, human physiology, neurobiology, and mammalian physiology as well. Her interests include endocrinology, reproduction, and the neurobiology of stress and anxiety. She is a co-author of articles on faith and science, and she has written extensively on the physiology of Christ's crucifixion. So we welcome you and thank you for being here, Dr. Shrier.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to assign some scripture verses. I have a lot of them. So if you can volunteer to read them, I'll give you the reference. I won't remember who I assigned them to, but if I call out the reference, just unmute yourself and read it for everybody. Okay, so we're going to look at Christ's crucifixion. And I first got interested in this in the chair of my department when I started teaching many years ago. I started teaching at APU at Azusa Pacific University 29 years ago, but it was a few years into it where he handed me a couple of index cards. Yes, back then we used index cards. And on it were a few references about Christ's crucifixion and the physiology and what his body went through. And he said, "Are you interested in this?" I went, "Yes." So I've taken it and I've developed it from there and read other kind of references and added to those references that he had provided for me. And we're going to go through and talk about what Jesus went through. Here are a few of my resources. I have other ones that I've included for this presentation, but these are the main ones that I will be using for today. So I like to start with St. Athanasius, and he has a quote that said, "Death had to precede resurrection, for there could be no resurrection without it." So I think oftentimes, even myself, we forget that Jesus was fully human. So his body is very important. That he came as a human, that is what's one of the unique things about Christianity, is that God came to be as a human and live among us. And you don't see that in any other kind of religion. So Jesus' body is very important. So Jesus needed to die for him to be resurrected, because that's where our hope lies, is in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is also a very unique thing to Christianity. So we need to remember that he was fully human and that he needed to die so that he could be resurrected. We're going to start this story then at the Passover meal, which we'll talk about that scripture at the end of this presentation also, that we use now for our communion services. So Jesus is having the Last Supper with his disciples. He's having a nice meal. He's probably in very good physical condition. He doesn't do much screen time back then. He did a lot of walking around. And so we know he's probably in pretty good physical condition at this point in time. He's had a really good meal. And does anybody remember, just unmute yourself, what's the Passover about? What are the Jews celebrating when they're celebrating Passover?
It memorializes the exodus from Egypt.
Exactly. That's when they had to put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, and then the angel of death passed over them and did not kill the firstborn, was killing the firstborn of everybody else that didn't have the blood of the lamb. So basically, they're celebrating their redemption from Egypt, which I think is an interesting place to start. So we also see in Luke 9:22, whoever has that, if you can read that Jesus understood what he was going to go through.
"For I, the Son of Man, must suffer many terrible things," he said. "I will be rejected by the leaders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. I will be killed, and 3 days later, I will be raised from the dead."
So Jesus being fully human, how does he know this? Well, like we know it. We study the Bible. The Holy Spirit reveals to us. So same thing. Jesus has been reading the Torah, the other laws, and the scriptures verses. And from that, then he's realizing that he's going to die and rise again. So he's telling his disciples this, and his disciples didn't get it. And if I were there among the crowd, I'm sure I wouldn't have gotten it either, because that's not the way the story was supposed to end. And so they have a different thing in mind than what Jesus is telling them is coming up. So now we're going to move to Jesus after the meal goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and prays. And there he's praying so earnestly that we see that his blood becomes like his sweat is like drops of blood. And we see that in Luke 22:39-44. If you can please read that.
And he came out and went, and as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground.
Now, this is an actual medical condition called hemohidrosis. This is a very rare condition that happens when somebody is under a lot of anguish or mental anxiety then. So, like I said, he knew what was coming up. And as he's praying then, he knows this anxiety. And we see that in what was just read there. And in Mark, we hear, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death." So we know Jesus is having a lot of anxiety over what's going to be coming because he's fully human and he knows it's going to be painful. So what happens in this kind of condition is your blood pressure is rising, his blood pressure is rising, and the smallest vessels are capillaries. And so they end up rupturing. And as they rupture, that blood is going to mix with his sweat and be dripping off of his body then. This is going to make his skin very tender, and it's going to be bruised now where this has occurred, this hemohidrosis then. So it's a breakdown of the capillaries. Again, a very rare condition, but it does occur, and it's in the medical books then. So now we see that Jesus is starting to have his physical well-being isn't as good now with the hemohidrosis. At this point now, he gets arrested in the garden. And we're going to read these verses, and I want you to listen to who it is that actually came to arrest Jesus. So I'd like you to read Luke 22:50 and 52, please.
Then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple police, and the elders who had come for him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit?"
Having arrested him, they led him away and brought him to the house of the high priest. But Peter was following at a distance. When it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying.
So in these verses, who do we see that's coming to arrest Jesus?
The Jewish religious leaders?
It's the Jewish religious leaders. Now, I'm just saying this because when I was in a lot of Easter pageants, it was usually the Roman soldiers that came. And I think it was because we had the costume with the red thing up on the top of the helmet, and we wanted to use the costume twice. So it is actually the Jewish leaders that are coming. So there's the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is made up of about 60 Jews, and these are the leaders. And at this time in the Bible, we see that the high priest was Caiaphas. So the high priest is over it. So the Jews have their own laws and regulations. But at this point in time, the Roman government was over top of them. So there's only certain things that they could do. But they arrest Jesus and they try Jesus, and they see that their witnesses were contradicting each other. They couldn't get a story together. But really what they wanted to do was saying Jesus was blaspheming. He was calling himself God. And we see in Matthew that Pilate later on says he saw that these people were just jealous. That's how it's termed and translated. They were just jealous of him. But they cannot kill Jesus. And Pilate is not a Jew, so he doesn't care if he's calling himself God. He doesn't care about blaspheming. So we see that the Jewish people have to incite the Roman government, which is over them, which can proceed with a crucifixion, but they cannot do that themselves. So in this process, that before with the trial, they're going to mock and beat Jesus. And we see that in Luke 22:63-65.
Now, the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him.
Right. So they want Jesus out of the way. They are jealous, according to Pilate. And so they need to get the Roman government to kill Jesus for them, since they can't do it. So they have the Roman government over them. So they go to Pilate, who is the governor of the area. So I like to think of that as kind of, since I live in California, the governor of California, and Pilate is over that area. But to get Pilate involved, they need to incite him. What's going to make him interested in this case if he doesn't care about blaspheming? So the charge that they brought up was that Jesus was claiming to be a king. And so he's saying to Pilate, if he's claiming to be a king, he's going to get the people under him, and there's going to be a revolution, and they're going to overthrow the Roman government. So if you don't take care of Jesus, then you are not a friend of Caesar's. Caesar was kind of like the president of the United States. He was over all of the Roman areas. And so they're saying, if you don't take care of Jesus, then he's going to throw it over, and you're not taking care of Caesar's area, in which was there in Judea. Now, Pilate hated the Jews. So this did not really make him too excited about it. He didn't want to do what they had to do. However, he was unjust and he took bribes, and he didn't want word to get back to Caesar and be removed from office. So he's playing a political game where he's trying to appease the Jews enough. So we see there's more going into this than just Jesus being crucified. There's this politics going on. So we see Luke 23:2, then the charge for being a king.
And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king."
So this is how they're trying to incite Pilate to get him involved in this whole scenario then. Now, Pilate is over this area right here, which is Judea. So he's like the governor of this area, and he's in Jerusalem right now. Well, through all of this, he realizes that Jesus is a Galilean. Well, up in Galilee is Herod. Herod's the governor up there. And I think of him as like the governor of the state of Washington then. And this is Herod Antipas. And he's over that area. So he's thinking, I don't have to deal with this. I'll just send them to Herod. Let Herod, take care of this. Well, he doesn't have to send him to Galilee. Herod was in town, and his palace is there in Jerusalem. So he just has to send him across town to Herod to have Herod take care of this issue. Now, Herod was the son of Herod the Great, and Herod the Great's the one who killed all the babies at the time of Jesus. So we kind of see some of that history coming now. So he sends him over to Herod, and let's look and see what happens, what Herod finds out then. Let's go to Luke 23:7-12, please.
When they answered that he was, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas, because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction, and Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus because he had heard about him and had been hoping for a long time to see him perform a miracle. He asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus refused to answer. Meanwhile, the leading priests and the teachers of religious law stood there shouting their accusations. Now Herod and his soldiers began mocking and ridiculing Jesus. When they put a royal robe on him and sent him back to Pilate, Herod and Pilate, who had been enemies before, became friends that day.
So I think it's kind of interesting that Herod and Pilate didn't like each other, and then over this whole scenario, now they're friends. It's kind of, I don't know where that came from, but basically Herod wanted Jesus to perform some miracles. He wanted him to perform for him, and Jesus didn't comply with that. And so he just sent him back then to Pilate. And we'll see what they both found when we see Luke 23:4.
Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man.
and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and as you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death."
So Jesus started with a good physical condition. He has the hemohidrosis. He has tender skin. He now has been marched back and forth through these different trials. He's been mocked, ridiculed. So now he has psychological, emotional, spiritual trauma that's going on with him. He's probably walked about 2.5 miles in this whole process. And Herod, again, is just trying to appease the Jews and thinks, well, let's just have him flogged, and then maybe the Jews will be happy with that. So we see in Matthew 27:26-31 then.
Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him, and they took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him.
So another thing we see in these verses here is about Barabbas. So again, Pilate's trying to get them to be okay. And he has Barabbas, and there was a tradition for them to release one of the prisoners. And he said, so, hey, who should I release, Jesus or Barabbas? And Barabbas was this terrible murderer. And they all yelled Barabbas. They wanted Jesus to die. So when you take the charge, when you took somebody before the Roman government, you had to have a charge, which they had, claiming to be a king. 2, you had to have a punishment for that, which they wanted Jesus to be crucified. Now, the other part of that was that if the person was found innocent, you got the punishment. So these people are very serious about what they're going after because they want Jesus to be crucified then. So let's look at the flogging then. This was a punishment required before crucifixion could occur, according to the Roman law. They have a whip, and the whip has many pieces of leather thongs. It's not like our Western kind of whip where there's only one piece. And they usually had the person, when they were whipped, those leather pieces would cut through the skin. Now remember, Jesus' skin was already tender from the hemohidrosis. So it cuts, just leaves this ribbons on the back. Usually at the ends of the leather, there's sheep bone, and the sheep bone then digs into the muscle and the flesh and rips it out as they pull the whip back then. So it tears the flesh out. By the time they're done, they probably have exposed maybe even some bone at this point as they remove muscle and stuff with that. Also in the middle of the leather are metal balls, and those metal balls are going to hit the skin, and as they hit the skin, that's going to cause further bruising and tenderness. So when the sheep bone comes in, even more flesh can be removed then. We also saw in that verse the crown and the thorns. So when they flog them usually naked, and it's from about the shoulders down to the top parts of the legs, like where the knees are. So all of that would probably just be open in ribbons of skin and have pieces of flesh missing. So as it cut through the muscle then in Jesus, he's going to lose a lot of blood, as you could imagine. And this is going to drop his blood pressure. Now, our body tries to compensate by constricting blood vessels with the little blood that's there. And our heart rate tries to increase to get the blood that we have around to our tissues, because our cells need oxygen, because oxygen is the final electron acceptor of the electron transport chain that allows our cells to make ATP so that they can do their jobs. And if they don't have ATP, which is their energy source to do their jobs, then they're going to die. So the heart is trying, the blood vessels are trying, but in this, because of the great loss of blood, his blood pressure is going to drop. When you lose blood pressure, when you lose blood, when you lose fluids, then your hypothalamus, part of your brain, makes you thirsty to replace that fluid. We'll see in Psalm 22 later on about Jesus being thirsty then. We also saw in the previous scriptures that they placed a robe on him. Now he has these open wounds, and this robe was just to mock him. So they put the robe on him and they put the crown of thorns. And the robe now, I imagine, would act like when a male has like been shaving and they cut themselves, they take a little toilet paper and they put it on the place that the cut was, it's going to clot it. So I can imagine that putting this robe on Jesus would clot the blood and help prevent more from being lost, not intentionally, but this is what it did do. The other thing that they do then is they put a crown of thorns on him. Now, these thorns are about 2 inches long. They're not our little thorns like we see on our roses. They're very long. And it also said they hit him on the head. So as he has his crown and they hit him on the head, those thorns are going to dig into his head. And as you are aware, when you get a cut on your head, you bleed way more than if you cut on someplace else in your body. So again, we're going to have loss of blood. There's also a nerve in that area called the trigeminal nerve that innervates the face. And there's some patients that can have trigeminal neuralgia, and that means that there's some irritation in that nerve, and it's excruciatingly painful. So painful, these people want to die because it hurts so bad. They can hardly even talk sometimes. So it's very likely that those thorns then would have damaged at least part of that nerve, and now Jesus would have also had pain going down his face from the damaged nerve then. So we see that Jesus' physical condition is critical even at this point in time. Now there's a question about the cross. Usually what we see is the Latin cross, which looks like a lowercase t, and it was more common at the time to use like a T-shaped cross that was more like a capital T, which is called tau, T-A-U, which is the Greek letter T is the tau. And so it's more common that more likely that he would have been crucified on a tau-shaped cross. That doesn't make a big difference in the whole scenario or not, just another piece of information. And with the cross, then the vertical piece was in the ground. So again, in a lot of the Easter pageants and Easter plays that I've been in, usually Jesus carries the full cross up. Well, really what it is, it's just the cross piece because the vertical piece is in the ground. So they would just tie it to their arms. Now, as he's carrying the cross piece, he has all those wounds in his back. And remember, he had the crown and the robe and the crown of thorns. And so they've removed those. And again, they probably weren't nice when they removed the robe. They probably ripped off that robe, which had now been stuck to all the wounds, which means now all the bleeding and loss of fluid is going to be happening again as they take that off. So as he has the cross piece now, it's also rubbing on those wounds as he's carrying it. So he's carrying just the cross piece. Now on the cross, there was a sign, and this was required by Roman law to say what the person was charged of. Does anybody remember what Pilate had put on this sign?
King of the Jews?
Yeah, this is the King of the Jews. And again, Pilate didn't like the Jews. He was mocking them by putting that on there. He wasn't trying to be prophetic like he was, but he was mocking the Jews. Hey, here's your king. Ha, he's on a cross. So we crucified him. So Jesus carries the cross piece up. He has the titulus up, the sign saying what he's been charged of. So now they're going to take him. He has to walk up the hill to Golgotha, where the vertical piece is. And we know that they recruit Simon of Cyrene from out of the crowd to help carry the cross piece up for Jesus then. When they get up there, then they only have the cross piece. So that would be dropped to the ground, and they'd probably throw Jesus to the ground. Again, that's going to open all of his wounds, and the dirt now is going to be rubbing in the wounds. And they're going to nail him to just the cross piece while he is lying on the ground. So he's on the ground. He has the dirt in his wounds. The wounds are all reopened, and he's going to lose some more blood at this point in time. Now, it's unlikely, and you probably have heard this, that he was nailed in his hands. In the hand, there, and this is held together by wires, but in the hand, there's very little to support the weight of the body. So the nails were really big, kind of like railroad ties, They're not like our little carpenter nails that we have at our homes. But when they put them through there, the weight of the body, again, he's exhausted. So he's total limp weight. That's going to pull down on those nails. If they went through the palm of the hand, it would have just ripped through the tissues. So it's unlikely that it went through the palm of the hand because they would not support the weight of his body. And this was researched by Dr. Babet, and he was a French surgeon. And this was in the 1900s that he used cadavers to look at this. But it's more likely that it was nailed through the wrist then. So I'm going to stop sharing so you can see a little bit better here. Because now the wrist bones will support the weight of the body, where if it was in the hand, it would not support the weight of the body. But those wrist bones now can support it. So it's unlikely that it went through the palm of the hand. It's more likely that it went through the wrist. Now, I am not a biblical scholar, so I asked a biblical scholar about this, and Dr. Bobby Duke said that in the Greek, hand can include the wrist. So interpreting that it went through the wrist instead of just through the palm of the hand is not outside what the Bible is telling us. So I felt more comfortable once I had heard that with this decision too. We're going to talk about nailing the feet right now, but he's still on the ground, but let's talk about the feet. It is likely that they nailed through the top of the feet because now, and this is a hand, but pretend it's a foot, the ankle bones, the gravity's pushing down on it. And so the weight of the ankle bones would support the weight of the body. So it is likely that it went through the top of the foot and they didn't have to go through like to the side of the ankle. That would not support the body then. So here we have the nail. There's different ways that they nailed the feet. Either they put them side by side on the cross, as demonstrated here with a nail through each one. And we could see that the weight of the body would be pushing down on those nails then, so therefore it would support the body weight. Sometimes they would cross the feet over and put one nail through the top of both feet. And sometimes they would take the feet, put them on the side of the cross, and then nail it through the heel. So we're not really sure how it happened in Jesus. We know that his feet were nailed, though. Now, in the nailing process, there's going to be some nerves that are damaged. In the arm, there's a major nerve called the median nerve. And if you're going through the wrist right here, it's very likely that the nerve was damaged, if not completely severed. And again, that's going to cause excruciating pain up Jesus' arms. In the leg, you've probably heard of people having sciatica. Then that's excruciating pain going down the leg. And nailing the feet probably at some point damaged portions of that nerve, which means now there'd be excruciating pain going up both of Jesus' legs then. So he's on the ground. We've nailed his wrists. We haven't nailed his feet yet. So now they have to pick the cross beam up and place it on the vertical piece. So his body is going to be hanging, his limp body is going to be hanging from all the weight in those two nails in his wrists. Now, Dr. Alex Metherall said, and then another colleague of mine at Azusa Pacific University said, who's a physicist, said, absolutely. The weight of his body and the angle that it's at would dislocate his shoulders and his elbows. So now Jesus' arms are probably about 6 inches longer than what they were to start with. So as they lift the crossbeam then, his weight pulls down on those two nails and they dislocate his shoulders and his elbows. And we see that in Psalm 22, and we'll read that later. Now that he's up there, then they would go ahead and nail the feet. All right, before we can continue, we need to understand about how we breathe. So I have a model here, which is this plastic is the chest cavity. The balloons are the lungs. This latex is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the muscle that separates our chest cavity from our abdominal cavity. The hole in the top then represents our mouth, our nose, and our trachea then. So when we breathe, the diaphragm needs to change the pressure that's inside our chest cavity. When we change the pressure, air wants to flow from high pressure to low pressure. So normally we start with our diaphragm dome shape, making our chest cavity smaller, which means the pressure is higher, which means the air is out of our lungs. Then when we inhale, we drop the diaphragm. And when we drop the diaphragm, that's going to increase the size of the thoracic cavity, which will drop the pressure inside the chest cavity, which means air now wants to go into our lungs, going from high pressure to low pressure. So here I am inhaling because I've dropped the diaphragm and I've increased the pressure. Here I'm exhaling. So we don't have to push air into the lungs. We don't have to suck air out of the lungs. All we do is change the pressure in our chest cavity, and the air automatically goes from high to low pressure. So that said, now with Jesus on the cross, then, he is hanging down. And when he's hanging down, that's going to elongate his chest cavity. When you elongate the chest cavity, that's going to lower the pressure, and the air is going to go in, as demonstrated here. So air is going to go into the lungs fairly easily. That is not going to be a problem. The problem comes when he's trying to exhale, because he has to shorten that chest cavity and let that diaphragm be able to come up to increase the pressure to get the air out. So breathing out is the difficult. So this crucifixion, which was reserved for the vilest of criminals, the worst of the worst, and we see that Jesus was innocent, that he's going through this, then it's really intended to be a slow, suffering form of death. A lot of times people didn't die for 2, 3, maybe even 4 days up there just suffering, and it's a slow form of suffocation. So if you've ever, I know, especially playing when you're younger, you're playing in a pool, somebody holds you under a little bit too long or holds a blanket over your head a little, you start fighting to try to be able to breathe. So they're going to be trying to fight to exhale to be able to breathe. So the chest is going to remain inflated because his body's going to be pulling down and increasing the size of the thoracic cavity then. And so he's now going to have to push up on his feet to shorten that chest cavity. So he's pushing up on those nails to be able to exhale. So they pull up on their arms. Again, there's nails in there, so that's going to cause excruciating pain, and push up on their feet, which that's going to cause excruciating pain. Now, there's a medical examiner who put out a paper in 21, Jujubi, and he kind of refutes that they would have to pull up. He was working with live volunteers on this process that weren't crucified and hadn't been beaten and so forth and so on. But when you have a body that's exhausted, it's going to be pulling down. So I do believe and go along with other medical professionals that he would have to be able to pull up. And if you've ever gone to the gym after working out and just tried to hang there for a little bit, it pulls down on that diaphragm. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to breathe. Now, we know that Jesus spoke 7 times from the cross. When we're speaking, are we exhaling or are we inhaling? We're exhaling. Usually we knock when we're inhaling, but it sounds really funny. So normally we're exhaling when we're speaking. Well, that's when Jesus would have had to be pulling up on his hands and pushing up on his feet and having the excruciating pain to be able to speak those words then, those 7 different times on the cross. And we know that one of those times was, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So in that pain and agonizing, he is forgiving people that had caused that pain. And I just think that so helps me to reset in my attitude. I can get upset. Somebody takes my parking space or, cuts in line in front of me or something like that. It really puts everything in perspective for me as to what's really important. And we just see Jesus' love, I think, ooze through that statement. And I think that's amazing. So now we're going to go to Luke 27:34-37.
They offered him wine to drink, mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. Then they sat down there and kept watch over him. Over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews."
Thank you. So he's hanging on the cross. He's nailed, his hands, his wrists, and his feet. And just probably, if this was a dirty area, it wasn't nice and clean area. There was dogs running around. There's probably birds coming and insects coming and eating at his flesh during this time. So it's really not a fun, definitely not a fun way to die. It was intended. I can't imagine that people sat around and said, how can we make people suffer? But they did that. And it was a slow form of suffocation. So when we inhale oxygen for our cells to make energy so they can survive. But we exhale out a waste gas, which is carbon dioxide, which comes from the breakdown of our energy sources like glucose, for instance. And so this CO2, because he can't exhale as often, that CO2 is going to be building up in his blood. Indirectly, that CO2 is going to cause the pH of the blood to drop and become more acidic. Now, this is not good in our body. Living organisms can only live between a pH of 6.8 and 8. And outside of that, you die. And we usually live in our body between 7.35 and 7.45, with the average being about 7.4. So when the pH starts getting too acidic, what happens is it affects our proteins. And we have lots of proteins in our body. All of our enzymes are proteins. And it causes them to unfold, or what's called denature. And then they cannot function, because function determines what structure that protein needs to be. And so if you change its shape, it can't function anymore. So all of our metabolic processes quit functioning, and there's a lot of things that can't work in the body because the proteins can't function properly. So we see this drop in the pH, and we saw that his blood pressure is dropping because he doesn't have the blood to help sustain, even though our body is trying to compensate and keep the blood pressure up and keep the blood flowing. So his poor little heart, there's very little blood there, very little oxygen. It's going to be working really hard. And as the tissues don't get enough oxygen, the capillaries are going to start leaking. So normally in our capillaries, our smallest vessels, there's some gaps, and it allows some small things and some fluid to go through it. But now they're going to get bigger gaps. So it'd be kind of like having your colander or your strainer when you're doing your spaghetti noodles. So more things are going to fall through that. So this fluid now is going to start collecting around the heart and around the lungs. So if you have fluid around the lungs, it'd be like somebody has pneumonia. That's going to be harder for them to breathe, harder to get the oxygen in and harder to get the carbon dioxide out. This fluid around the heart then is going to make it harder on the heart to try to contract. And this is a condition called cardiac tamponade. It's an emergency situation if one of us has it. So we see that the heart is working really hard. It has this fluid around it. It's working even harder. It itself, not only does blood go through the heart, but blood has to go to the heart muscle to give oxygen to those cells so those cells can make energy so that they can contract. So if they're not getting energy, they can't contract anymore. So now we see that likely that the heart is failing because it has this fluid around it, which is called pericardial effusion. And there's fluid around the lungs from the leaky capillaries in the lungs called pleural effusion then. So here is a diagram. This is the heart. There's this connective tissue. So if you have a model of a heart here, it's about the size of your fist, and you have a connective tissue sac around it, kind of like this baggie is right here. So as the capillaries leak, they leak into the baggie and constrain right around the heart and make it very difficult for the heart to continue to function. So this is showing here that sac is called the pericardial sac. So the fluid is filling in right in there. And so that's called the pericardial effusion. You have the lungs. They also have this like a baggie around them, a connective tissue sac, and the fluid is filling in around here too from the leaky capillary. So we have the pleural effusion and the pericardial effusion that's going on. So the heart has worked really hard. It's trying to stay up, trying to get oxygen to all the tissues. It can't. It doesn't even get enough oxygen for its own tissues. So now he has a heart attack. And we don't know that for sure, but it's very possible that this is the reason Jesus died. Now, the other thing that's going on here, people will say that Jesus died of a broken heart then. So the leaders didn't want the bodies up for crucifixion. They wanted, for during the Passover. So they wanted the bodies down. So they asked the soldiers if they could go break their legs. What would breaking the legs of these people do? Or breaking the legs of Jesus do?
Prevent him from pushing up and being able to breathe.
Right. He's not going to be able to push up. He's not going to be able to exhale as much. So now that CO2 is going to be accumulating even faster. But when they come to Jesus, they see that he's already dead and they don't break his legs. Now, also breaking legs is going to cause more hemorrhaging, more blood loss. And so that could hasten the death also. The other thing is with Jesus, though, they didn't break his legs, but they did pierce his side with a spear. So if Jesus is hanging up on a cross or up above them, they're going to take a spear and jam it up into his ribs then. So here we have a picture with a spear. It's going to go through the ribs. And if we take a cross section through Jesus and show you here, we have the lung from the right side here. We have the lung from the left side here, and you have the heart here in the middle. So the spear would have gone through where that lung was and through that pericardial sac into the heart. And when they pulled the spear out, blood and water came out. And this makes sense because the water would have been accumulating here in the pleural and the pericardial sacs. So now we're going to go to Psalm 22. And this is Psalm. So this is in the Old Testament. So this is before Jesus is even born. This is actually a prophecy of Jesus' crucifixion. And it was written approximately 700 years before crucifixion was even practiced. So this is not something somebody saw and was writing about. And I want you to see in these verses the things that we've talked about so far. So if you can go ahead and read Psalm 22, please.
I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my, my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.
So we see a lot of the things that we talked about already today in Psalm 22. And my husband, who's a theologian, Paul Schreier, pointed out to me when Jesus cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? What that was the first line of Psalm 22. So in Jewish practices, they knew that Jesus meant that whole section of Psalm 22, which was leading back to the prophecy of his crucifixion, which I think is pretty amazing also. So when I've been studying this, and then I saw a lot of crucifixes, and we see Jesus on a cross. It's usually a Latin cross, not a big deal. And he has a crown of thorn on, maybe some blood coming down, maybe some blood coming out of his side, but it's too peaceful. It's like he's asleep because he's dead, right? So they're showing him when he's dead. But I was walking through one of the buildings at APU one time, and there was a display from one of the art students, Gretchen San Nicolas, and she had this bust of Jesus. And I went, that's it. And I asked her, can I please use that in my talks? And she said, absolutely. So this is what I saw. And this is what I think demonstrates what went through in the crucifixion, what Jesus had to endure as being fully human, his body, and what he had to do for us. Yet in Hebrews, we hear it said that he counted it joy to endure the cross for us. So how much love he showed to allow us to have eternal life and for us to have hope then. So I want to end today with 1 Corinthians 11:23-26. And this is the verse that's often used during our communion time. The Lord Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink, in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So I'm just hoping that through all of this, one, you just understand how much God and Jesus loves you. I mean, I just think it's an amazing expression of love that Jesus did for us. He didn't want to. We saw him in the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew what was going to have to do, but he said, "Not my will, but thine be done." And then it was joy for him to endure for us. And just in your tough times, remember that Jesus understands our suffering. He came as a human and suffered one of the worst deaths that somebody could have. And so he understands our suffering. That's all I have for you today. And if you have any questions or comments, I would be happy to listen to those and hear those.
First, thank you so much for your informative, albeit depressing talk.
Yeah.
2 points. It is said that Jesus was given wine or vinegar mixed with gall to drink. I had always considered that that was an attempt to mitigate the pain of the person being crucified. And I wonder if you could shed any light on why this was given to him and other victims.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard that it was used as an analgesic. To me, it seems more like a mocking thing. You're thirsty, so here's something sour for you. It's not something enjoyable. I may be totally wrong on this, and you might be right that it was to help decrease the pain. We know that Jesus refused it one way or the other. So I'm really not clear on that. From what the studying that I've done, and I haven't gone extensively on that one point, I'm unclear on why that would have been offered. Yeah, that's a good point, though, David. Appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Second point I had was I hadn't realized that a cross was considered to be tau shaped at that point. And that reminds
what was used more at that time, apparently. And again, it's not a big issue. I mean, it doesn't change, the importance of his death or the resurrection or anything else. I just think it's an interesting piece of information. So yeah.
Well, to me, it makes it more important because in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel has a vision in the temple where the people in the temple are to be killed. But God has directed an angel or someone to mark those who have been faithful. And they're to mark those people with a towel on their forehead.
Okay.
And so it makes me wonder whether in Jesus' time a cross was referred to as a towel.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Again, I'm not sure with all the, translations and everything that they do and the Old Testament, New Testament, those kinds of things, and then changing it to the Greek. And I mean, there's a lot that goes on in that, but I think that's very interesting that you noted that. And I think there's a lot of those kind of hidden gems in the Bible. I think God's had explains a lot of different things in different ways. So I think that's an interesting aspect. Thank you, David.
I'm interested in that, David, because there's no Hebrew letter that looks like a tau.
Because that's Greek.
Zion. Yes, but Ezekiel's in Hebrew.
Old Testament, yeah. I know that got translated to Greek, but I don't know how that all works.
Well, the Hebrew alphabet changed drastically at one point. The Hebrew alphabet is now written in what is called square script, as I recall. And before then, if you look at the older Hebrew alphabets, the tau looks more like RX, or cross between a small x and an x and a small t, lowercase t.
Interesting.
The tau. So the tau is a Greek letter. So there's some Hebrew letter that looks like a tau.
No, the tau is a Hebrew letter.
The tau
is a Hebrew letter. That's the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
Tav. Tav looked like a T before?
Before the square script, a Hebrew tau, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, looked a bit like an X or a sans serif lowercase t.
Okay. Yeah.
So in other words, it Looks a bit like a cross or
Yeah,
a tilted cross.
yeah, I think of that as the letter Tav is how a Hebrew would say it, but you call it Tav.
Oh, okay. Mm-mm. Part of my pronunciation.
Yeah, okay.
Colleen, did I understand that you did not see the movie The Passion of the Christ?
I did not. I mean, that's so gruesome. I can't do that.
Yeah.
Even
I
studying this stuff, I get moved by it every time. And I just like, that's just something I could not do. I know people who have had wonderful experiences with it, and God bless them, but I knew how gruesome it was going to be. And I just thought, I can't watch that. So,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
I saw it in the theater and I could barely drive home at the end.
Oh,
I had getting a little emotional now just thinking about it. But and
yeah.
then I bought the DVD thinking I might watch it again, but I haven't been able to bring myself to watch it again. But thank you for sharing what you did. It was very yeah, it's just very emotional moment.
Thank you. Yeah, well, it's what Jesus did. All I'm doing is sharing what Jesus did.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sam, I've seen the movie too, and it is very moving, as was this talk, Colleen. So thank you very much. Sobering, but very real. And Kathleen Tallman, I'm seeing that you're here and recalling several years ago, I believe you gave a similar talk at the Southern Cal Day Conference up at Westmont, right?
I think mine was a little more on what happens between the crucifixion and the resurrection and kind of
Okay.
that space. But I think this leads into it so well. You can imagine, I think sometimes we go to Easter service and we think, oh, they were so slow to understand. And it's like the
Yeah.
events of that Friday, I can't imagine not just the grief of what they saw, but just also their own grief from the betrayals and denying Jesus, and just how hard it would be for them to understand that he had risen again.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, in my tradition, we tend to, celebrate the resurrection. We didn't spend a lot of time on the Good Friday. And the disciples, I mean, Jesus was dead. Jesus was dead. This is not how the story was supposed to end for them in their mind. What's going on? All the confusion. I mean, just what they were going through in those a couple of days that they had to deal with this. Like, what's now? They all left Jesus, and now they're all gathering together, trying to figure it out together. It
Yeah.
just must be very confusing and be very difficult. Couldn't imagine being in that scenario.
Yeah. When you think of Mary too, and what she went through with it all.
Absolutely.
I actually had a colleague at the university where I've taught, an unbeliever who said to me, "Why do you guys call it Good Friday?" And of course, we all know why. But
Right.
it was a moment to really explain why, out of this pain and suffering, the most good of all was able to
Wow.
transpire.
That's a good setup for you.
Yeah, exactly. I could have asked for a better one.
I just want to take the opportunity to thank Julie too. She's just popped something in the chat that she's got 60 students with her that have just heard this. So thank you, Julie, for organizing that. And hello, students. I see that Dana's put a plug in for Washington, D.C. So we'd love to see some of you there. And sneak peek, we're actually going to be at Colorado Christian next July. So it's not public yet, but that's where it's looking like we're going to be. So we look forward to being with you next summer there.
Well, I just have a comment that the suffering that Jesus suffered physically was just astronomical in its magnitude. But I heard a theologian say that bearing the sins of the world and the wrath of God was even a greater magnitude than the physical, on top of that. So I just wanted to add that in too. So it was, even beyond the physical, what we've been looking at.
Oh, yeah. Couldn't imagine. Yeah, I don't know what that's like. So, yeah, absolutely.
Looks like there's a question from one of the students asking, how does Christ's crucifixion compare to other crucifixions of the time?
I think in general is pretty similar. Again, but what was already mentioned, I think it was Jay that mentioned it, now he has the whole sin of the world on him too. And so I think it's different in that manner. Probably physically, again, Jesus is fully human. He's doing exactly like somebody else would have for the most part. And so it seems like similar to what the thieves had gone through it, which were on his right and left, probably very similar. But he also had those other trials ahead of time, and they had the hemohydrosis ahead of time that they probably wouldn't have had. So there's probably a little bit leading up to that, that he also has the emotional, psychological, the betrayal, all the other things that are going on right before, even before the trial with Pilate. So good question, though. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so there's a very interesting comparison. So about within a century of when Jesus died on the cross, Spartacus started a rebellion of slaves against the Romans. And as an outcome of it, they crucified like 10,000 soldiers, including Spartacus, all along the Appian Way. Um, and in the movie about that, which sometimes Hollywood doesn't get it right, but they said their purpose was not only to kill Spartacus, but to kill the idea of Spartacus, kill the idea that through rebellion slaves could free themselves. And then, think of that as why maybe Jesus was killed, not only to kill Jesus, but to kill the idea of Jesus, but just the opposite.
Yeah. So yeah, we know with crucifixion they were hung up there so to make a spectacle of them, it's to be a deterrent then to other people. So similar to what you were talking about, Fred. And so yeah, whether it's the idea of Jesus, because again, Pilate didn't like the Jews, but maybe the Jews were thinking of it in that term, was that we could end what was going on with Jesus and his followers. But maybe.
Yeah, as an outcome, like if you look at all the things that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is no mention of Jesus in any of that. And yet, so many of those scrolls were written at the time of Jesus. So they were trying to kill the idea of Jesus. And what made them so mad is instead of killing the idea of Jesus, they just made this movement that
Yeah. Yeah, splattered. Everybody went different directions and spread it. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure about that or not. Again, I'm not a theologian or a biblical scholar or any of that kind of stuff. But yeah, absolutely. I know that it did splatter like you're talking about.
Was it normal for someone to be able to speak from the cross as much as Jesus did? And also, why was Jesus up with the two thieves? Was there significance to that?
Yeah, I don't know about the significance of the two thieves. I have not heard or read anything about that. It just seemed to be at the same time. The speaking, we know that the thief spoke to Jesus, so apparently they could speak. I don't know if they spoke as much as Jesus or not, but we know the 7 things that he said were pretty significant for everything that he had, talking to his mother and to John and stuff like that, that there were some very significant things that he probably felt like he needed to say and to let the world know. So
a couple of days ago, I had a conversation with a fellow that grew up Hindu and married somebody that grew up Catholic, and they're passing away of a terminal disease probably. So he was asking what heaven's like, and
wow.
I said, "Well, would you like to go to heaven?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, let me tell you the story about Jesus and the two thieves. His mind is it's affecting his mind. So I made it as brief as possible. So I just read him the part where the one thief said, Jesus, you have no sin or no wrong. Remember me when you go to paradise. And I said, would you like to pray that? And he said, yeah. So
Wow. That's awesome.
Jesus, you have done no wrong. Remember me when you go to paradise. And his wife said after that, he felt just a whole lot less anxiety. So
That's what it's all about. That's what the cross is all about, and the resurrection. That is just so amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so encouraging.
There's only about 12 people that we know for sure from the Bible that have gone to heaven, and that thief is one of them.
You made it pretty clear. That's good.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, so maybe I'll wrap up with a short word of prayer. That's all right?
Please.
Okay, beautiful. Thanks, everyone. Dear Lord, we come to you now humbled and sobered as we have just heard and explored from Dr. Shrier, just of what you endured for us, Lord. We thank you that you who knew no sin became sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. And Lord, I pray that as we go from here, that you might encourage our hearts of just your love and the lengths that you were willing to go to save us, and that might encourage us to share your gospel with others, that they might come to know the life that's only found in you, O Lord. So I ask that you protect us and keep us in this night and encourage our hearts and strengthen us for the ministry and the lives that you are building for us. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Colleen.